Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news, which as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you are having an amazing day. We have lots of news to get through in this video, but I want to start things out with AMD, specifically a potential leak that the release date for their upcoming CPUs and GPUs, to be clear, Ryzen 4000 and Big Navi RDNA 2, Navi 2X, whatever you want to call it, has been delayed. Now, to be clear, AMD themselves have not stated the exact release date for their products. All they've said is that we will see both sets of products launched by the end of the year. But there had been a rumour swirling that we will see the products, especially the graphics cards, launch at some point in October. Twitter user 0x22h has stated that AMD has delayed the release time for its GPUs and CPUs, with the original release date being October the 7th. If you take a look over their Twitter history, they are fairly accurate in the past with certain information, and so it's not inconceivable that this info is accurate. I would of course stress two things. One, it may be inaccurate, and two, AMD technically speaking haven't given a release date anyway, so it's not like they've promised a set release date and then they've had to delay it for whatever reason. So it would more be an internal target that was missed rather than a promise to users that was missed, which I guess is okay. Then again, I suppose technically speaking, they would have promised or at least given a kind of insight to AIBs, that type of thing. Now, what's also kind of adding to this is quite a while ago now I had an exclusive that at AMD's CES event we would not be seeing any mention of RDNA 2, and of course that turned out to be the case. Indeed, what they would instead do was kind of host a specific event later on where they would kind of detail that stuff. Or at least some stuff. There's still an awful lot about RDNA 2 we do not know about, but RDNA 2 will be critical because, for one, it supports DirectX 12 Ultimate, whereas the first generation of RDNA does not. So it's missing key features like variable rate shading, as well as hardware-based ray tracing. Anyway, this same source told me several things, including the fact that the cards would actually most likely launch in summer, although the release date at that time had not been set in stone. So I'll be very curious if 0x22h's information is accurate, and my previous source was accurate, and generally speaking they have been extremely reliable. It would mean that AMD potentially have missed two release targets. That actually may not be bad. It may be a deliberate thing for them to hold out to see what Nvidia are doing. I am very confident that Nvidia's next generation products are going to be very impressive. And given the fact that the next generation of consoles will launch at the end of the year as well, it could be that neither want to be out of position in terms of price to performance ratio, and I think that's going to be of critical importance when competing, essentially they are, against the next generation systems. Think of it this way, people do not have unlimited funds, so if you've only got, let's say, $500, $600, you may be tempted to just say, well, I'm just going to pick up an Xbox or a PlayStation and just kind of hold off on my GPU purchase, and I will not be surprised if quite a few people do that. Anyway, we're now going to mosey on over to some PlayStation news, and this comes courtesy of Digital Foundry. A number of you actually sent me over the links to this, which is where Mark Cerny provides a few additional quotes to what we saw from the Road to PS5 event. Now I'm going to go into this with the assumption you've seen the Road to PS5 event, because quite frankly, if you haven't, a lot of what I'm about to say is not going to have any context and meaning. I will also say that I have not seen Digital Foundry's video. I'm only basing this off the article, particularly the quotes from Mark Cerny, because I think that they are the most important. Indeed, what I want to focus on in this particular video is the PlayStation 5's boost frequencies and how they function. As there has been a really big point of contention between people on the internet, as usual, on how the PlayStation 5's GPU will fare at maintaining the 2.23 GHz clock frequency. Now, for some time, I've been of the mindset that Sony will be able to largely keep the clock frequency of the PS5's GPU at the 2.23 GHz. And I was also pretty adamant that the CPU also wouldn't see massive dips. Because from what I'd been told, and I actually detailed this just recently in an exclusive as well, the only time that really and truly you were going to see massive dips in, let's say, the clock frequencies is if you were to put the CPU or GPU in an unnatural load, i.e. a workload that was not for gaming. So if you were to run essentially what you could say a synthetic test of very strenuous AVX instructions on a constant loop, which is not something you would ever do in a game, then of course clock frequencies would vary. But anyway, getting from this and what Mark Cerny himself said, he said that they do not use the temperature of the die itself because of variances between the PlayStation 5. So in other words, one, you could have a PS5 which is, let's say, kind of like in a cabinet or just in a hot environment, and another one could be like in an Arctic freezer. So clearly the clock frequency there would start to differ. The second is that silicon quality can also vary. And this is not anything new, you just can't do anything about variance in silicon quality. So what they can do instead is to use an algorithm, and this is an exact quote, so instead of using a temperature of the die, we use an algorithm in which the frequency depends on the CPU and GPU activity information. That keeps the behavior between the two balanced and consistent. I'm also going to read out this next part verbatim as well. If the CPU doesn't use power budget, for example, it's capped at 3.5 GHz, then the unused portion of the budget goes to the GPU. That's what AMD calls smart shift. There's enough power that both the CPU and GPU can potentially run at the limits of 3500 and 2.23 GHz. It isn't the case the developer has to choose to run one or the other slower. And there's another phenomenon here, which is called race to idle. Let's imagine we are running at 30 Hz. We are using 28 milliseconds out of the 33 millisecond budget. So the GPU is idle for 5 milliseconds. The power control logic will detect the low power being consumed. After all, the GPU is not doing much. And this will conclude the frequency should be increased. But it would just be a pointless bump. So in which case, it would then divert that power to the CPU. So how does this work? Well, it seems like if the GPU is able to render a frame faster than what's required for vertical sync, so let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that they're targeting, let's say, 60 FPS. That means a new frame needs to be created roughly every 16.66 milliseconds. You can find out, by the way, how long a frame takes to render by taking 1000, which obviously represents the number of milliseconds in a second, and then you can divide that by a particular frame rate. So you could divide it by 30 or 60 or 120 or whatever, and that gives you how long each frame on average needs to take to maintain 30 or 60 or whatever frames per second. So in short, if you have portions of a frame where it's idle, that power can then quickly be diverted to the CPU to maintain clock frequency. The other problem that appears to be happening right now is linked to development kits, and that is that essentially there are almost like profiles, I suppose you could say, which would push towards CPU or the GPU having performance priority. But it is because it's a development kit. And final retail hardware will not behave in this manner. So in other words, it will be dynamic and depend upon the code itself. And to reinforce this, Cerny himself reiterated exactly what he said at the Road to PS5 presentation. In general, a 10% reduction in power is just a few percent reduction in frequency. However, what he hasn't provided is exact workloads, which would be really handy for us to see kind of live code. And it also has not provided kind of the lower limits of what the CPU or GPU will dip to. So it kind of seems like to me that on average you can expect the CPU and GPU to maintain whatever the maximum clock frequencies are, their respective clock frequencies. But of course, in certain workloads, especially if the game is not optimized, then of course that can change accordingly. Honestly, much of what Cerny said here was kind of said anyway in the Road to PS5 event, and my own information, I recently put out an exclusive which has done pretty well. We've got quite a few views from that, so I'd like to thank everyone who has been watching that video. And in my own exclusive, I kind of said much the same thing, that it's really going to be down to the workload itself, and when you're talking about clock frequency, it's not really the exact question you need to ask. And furthermore, it really comes down to the optimization. For example, Cerny himself in this article, I'm not going to read out all of it because that would be unfair to Eurogamer, so I'll link, of course, their work in the video description. But one of the things they also states is that heavy workloads on the PS4 could have a good chance of basically causing the system to crash or overheat or what have you, and it's one of the reasons that the fan was just bad for the PS4 Pro. I mean, to be fair, mine wasn't awful, my PS4 Pro, and I bought it at launch, but I know some people had some really noisy fans in their system, and that does include God of War. But you can hear it crank up sometimes, and one of the things that my source said is that it really comes down to the flexibility of the culling of geometry. If the developers had had a little more flexibility in how they could have culled geometry earlier on in the pipeline, it probably wouldn't have been so noisy. So I do feel that with both next generation consoles, and I've got some Xbox news in a moment, this is not just a case of the CPU equals X and the, GPU equals Y. I think there's a lot more beneath the surface here. And quite frankly, I'm going to just say confident that both systems have a lot of customization, which, quite frankly, we do not know about yet. And even things like buses, because when you talk about bus, people say, oh, the PlayStation 5, has a 256-bit bus and it runs with this amount of, memory bandwidth and yada, yada, yada. And all of that's true, but there's also a lot of other questions, like how much bandwidth is set aside for the CPU cores? How much bandwidth does the GPU have access to? What is the bus layout between the various components on the APU? For example, with the PS4, it had several different buses. It had one bus which directly linked the CPU to the memory, and one bus which would directly link the GPU to the memory. And the CPU could have just around 20 gigabytes per second of bandwidth nommed up from the 176 gigabytes per second total of the system. But clearly, the Zen 2 cores in the PlayStation 5 as well as the Xbox are going to be very different. And they're going to be a lot hungrier to feed. So all of these questions kind of come into play, and also things like caching. I'm very confident the cache of RDNA 2 is going to be significantly larger than what we had with the previous generation of RDNA, which means ultimately the GPU itself is probably going to be less bandwidth hungry, and it's probably going to be more efficient. And I believe that while the PlayStation is going to have a learning curve to optimize for, basically figuring out, or the developers, figuring out how to maximize the clock frequency, but there's also a lot of other stuff, like how to best use the Tempest engine, how to best use the geometry engine. I recently covered as well in the same video that the Tempest engine, the Tempest engine can also do other things. It can process more than just audio. So, for developers to kind of squeeze the most out of the PlayStation hardware is going to take a while. It's the same thing for the Xbox. 52 compute units is an awful lot of compute units, and that's not even including all the custom stuff in the hardware. But it's going to take a long time for developers to best know how to utilize all of those compute units. And once again, that's not including all the rest of the stuff in the hardware. There's quite frankly a lot more I want to say on the PlayStation topic, but for now I'm going to shift to the Xbox, because there's also been some very interesting comments from Phil Spencer as well. We'll link the interview from IGN where Phil was kind of divulging some information of some of their strategies. Now, he hasn't given a price before anyone crosses their fingers, but he did say that they had to have a price target at the beginning of the console design. But what they are doing is keeping their, quote, eyes open as they continue towards launch. And what they want to do is make sure that they stay as flexible as possible with the price. I think, basically, if you're reading between the lines, what they don't want is for an obviously huge price disparity between the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox. Microsoft can probably take more of a loss than Sony can per console sold, but then again, from all of my information, the Xbox is also more expensive to build. It's going to be very interesting to see what both of these boxes end up costing. I'm personally guessing that the PlayStation 5 is going to hit $399, and I think the Xbox is probably going to be about the same price. Maybe $500. I think if Microsoft are willing to swallow quite a loss per console, they're probably going to charge like $399. But I think realistically, it's going to be $450 to $500. I think Microsoft would be very hesitant to do $500 though, because you've also got to take into consideration what's going on in the world. My personal bet right now is that Microsoft will charge an extra $50 on top of the PlayStation, but they will try to offset that by bundling in 6 or 12 months of Game Pass, and I think that's probably what they're going to do. I'm not basing this, by the way, on a leak or anything like that. I'm just guessing that they will have to charge more than the PlayStation, because, to my understanding anyway, the system is more expensive to build. But I don't think that they're going to want to be that much more expensive than the PlayStation, because if they're like $100 more, it's quite difficult for users to kind of justify spending $100 more. At least in my opinion. Let me know what you think on that one. But in the final set of quotes I want to provide you with Phil, in an Unlocked podcast, Phil also states that he feels very good about how the Series X lined up. I think Mark and the team did some really great work on the audio processing that they talked about. This is, by the way, in reference to Mark Cerny. And the SSD technology is impressive. We like that. We saw the work they did, but we think we took the holistic approach in our platform, from CPU to GPU to RAM to throughput, velocity architecture, latency, backwards compatibility, and it took us years to get to this point. So I definitely have respect for any platform's team that's launching, because, well, it takes a lot of work. But I will say, when we finally saw the public disclosure, I felt even better about the choices we made about our platform. And I kind of expected that I would. The hardware team that did Xbox One and Xbox One X, I just have a lot of confidence in them. If I give them the time and the targets to hit, I believe their ability creates a great end-to-end program. Once again, those are very confident words from Phil. Personally, at this point, I'm pretty sure that both consoles are going to be very impressive. I'm much more interested in this point in knowing what the actual games are going to be for the lineup. To me, the big questions remain for both systems. A, will we see the consoles launch at a price which is going to make our eyes kind of bleed? B, what would be the games lineup for both systems? There have been some ridiculous rumours for both sides of R at this point. So I want to know what the games lineup is, because quite frankly I think that's going to be extremely important. And the last is, of course, what about the ecosystem itself? And yeah, I personally believe at this point both machines are going to be... I think you're going to be pretty happy with both machines. I'm very much liking what I'm hearing about both systems. And as a PC gamer, primarily, I will say I'm going to be curious to see how the PC market, responds to the release of both systems. Anyways, I think that's just about it for this particular video. I'm working on several analysis videos right now, which is the reason I'm not getting super technical in this video, despite several messages asking me to. The first video I'm working on is a really in-depth explanation on DirectX 12 Ultimate. So that's actually one of the reasons my voice is a bit scratchy, because I recorded a whole bunch of stuff on camera today. And so I've recorded basically all the stuff for DirectX 12 Ultimate, so hopefully that will be up in the next couple of days. I've also redone all of the DLSS stuff and AI upscaling stuff. I've had to redo that video literally 3 times now because of new releases. So I'm just like, at this point, please, no one like change DLSS, no one do anything, it's all good, just leave it alone for my sanity, because I'm going to start rocking backwards and forwards in a chair otherwise. Yeah, there's that, and there's also some PlayStation stuff which is upcoming as well. So basically what I'm trying to do at the moment on the channel, the best I can anyway, is to balance stuff out. As there was a lot of PlayStation stuff like for a couple of videos in a row, and I don't want to just do that because I want the channel to be, you know, kind of neutral as much as possible. So I want to also release stuff on the Xbox for a while and PC platforms, and then of course I can get back to other things. Oh, and one last little thing. There has been some rumours, well actually not even rumours, but there have been a couple of stories floating around which of course were totally April Fools, and one of them was the Radeon RX Gamma, which was an alleged set of information for AMD's next generation graphics cards. This was an April Fool's by WCCF Tech, and I'm not calling them out. I'm more, I can't believe I even need to say this in a video, because they were literally pushing stuff which, you know, if you're not technical, you know, if you're just the average person, you don't know what, you know, a compute unit is. You don't know what the hell ray tracing is. That's fine. No problem at all. But several tech websites literally put this stuff up. They basically threw up WCCF Tech's article, and this included the references like GDDR7. So what I'm saying in the video is, yeah, if you see something like that, then yeah, it's not accurate. I don't think I need to tell most of you that that's the case, because I know most of you watching are pretty technical, but I'm just throwing it in because, well, yeah. Anyway, with all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. Normal stuff, like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.